I remember the day my sister Elaine was born as though it was filmed in slow motion. My mother, who had always been a little overbearing, seemed to transform overnight into a zealot of maternal devotion. Meanwhile, my father, never one to get too emotionally carried away, found his entire world reshaped around this newest addition. I was 6 years old enough to notice the difference in how they cradled her, old enough to hear the gentle hush in their voices whenever they spoke her name. She was a lovely baby, of course. They always are. But Elaine was the kind of child who seemed to glimmer even when the lights were low. From day one, she had the entire family enchanted, and I was simply an afterthought in my own home. The moment I realized just how stark this contrast would become was the Christmas after her birth. Presents piled beneath the tree, and I couldn't help noticing how the gifts for me felt almost like pity offerings compared to the lavish, expensive items labeled for her. She was 7 months old. She wouldn't even remember that holiday. But my mother insisted on capturing every squeal, every coo, every grin she made. Whenever I tried to show off the remote-controlled car I'd carefully saved up for, I'd get a quick nod and a fleeting smile. Then the camera lens would turn back to Elaine, who was too young to do much more than drool on a plush teddy bear. Even then, her drool was apparently more enchanting than anything I had to offer. I resolved at that young age not to grow bitter. I told myself that it was natural for an infant to get more attention. I convinced myself I'd eventually get my share, or at least something resembling fairness. I tried to be the best big brother I could be, reading her storybooks when she was older, pushing her on the swing at the neighborhood park. But every nice gesture seemed to feed the family's adoration for her, not a reciprocal love for me. If I tried to state my needs or wanted to do something special, I'd be accused of overshadowing her. It was as if my entire role existed only as an accessory to Elaine's brilliance. And at that age, I didn't know how to fight that. So I swallowed the injustice, believing I could still forge a good sibling bond. Elaine grew into a dazzling child, with shiny hair that never seemed to tangle, a melodic giggle that made relatives swoon, and an uncanny knack for winning people over with a simple flutter of her eyelashes. She was clever too. I recall a moment in 3rd grade, she was in 1st, when she insisted on reading from my math workbook. She rattled off multiplication facts as though she were reciting the alphabet, earning effusive praise from our parents for her obvious giftedness. Meanwhile, if I dared to correct her or point out that I'd worked on those exact same problems when I was her age, I'd be deemed jealous or insecure. That label stung me into silence, and I'd retreat into my bedroom while voices down the hall marveled at her brilliance. Occasionally, my grandmother would place a reassuring hand on my shoulder, whispering that everything would be okay, that she saw me and she appreciated me, but that only gave me a brief moment of respite from the overshadowing presence that was Elaine. My grandmother was perhaps the only one who never placed me second, but she lived states away and only visited during certain holidays. Everyone else was enthralled by the golden child. When Elaine entered middle school and I advanced into high school, the gap between us transformed from an age difference to a measure of importance in the house. Even though I was balancing tough classes, extracurriculars, and a part-time job at the local grocery store, all my parents seemed to talk about was Elaine's honors classes, her awards for dance recitals, and her leading roles in school plays. At dinner, I'd bring up something about my day, but it would quickly be swept aside by the urgent need to discuss Elaine's upcoming science fair project or her piano recital. It was as if the entire family was on a mission to market Elaine as the perfect child, and I was just a minor supporting actor in her show. Our mother had a way of making me feel like an inconvenience if I spoke for too long. My father would shrug whenever I voiced a concern, offering a mumbled, "Go ask your mother." I'd ask my mother for something, but she'd be too busy curling Elaine's hair or sewing a costume for her next performance. The message was unmistakable. I was simply not a priority here. High school was especially challenging. By then, I'd long understood that any parental support for my goals was tepid at best. My dream was to join the track team and maybe earn a scholarship to a decent college. But instead of even attending a single meet, my parents preferred to shuttle Elaine to her many competitions. Debate tournaments, violin recitals, math challenges, you name it. If something overlapped on the calendar, my event would be dropped without discussion. "I'm sure you can get a ride from a friend," they'd say. "Elaine really needs our support right now." As a sophomore, I had one of my best races. beating my personal record in the 400-meter dash, and when I finally returned home, sweaty and proud, I found the house empty. My parents, along with Elaine, had gone out to celebrate the fact that she won a regional writing competition. I had to heat up leftovers and clap quietly for myself because no one else was there to share that moment. The sting was still there the next morning when my father asked if I'd be home early enough to mow the lawn after school, as if my track victory were a minor footnote no one cared to remember. Things escalated when Elaine started dating a guy named Marcus in her freshman year of high school, the same year I was finishing my own senior year. Marcus was from a well-off family, and his status seemed to further cement her golden child image. Our parents were thrilled. Apparently, she was so radiant, even the wealthier families in town couldn't resist her charm. I had my own set of social challenges, trying to figure out what I wanted after graduation. But even that was overshadowed by talk of Elaine and Marcus. How adorable they looked. How accomplished they both were. It was as if my own experiences, my first heartbreak, my acceptance into a decent college a few towns away, barely registered in the family ledger. When I tried to share my college acceptance letter, my mother looked up from her phone, gave me a curt nod, then drifted right back into her conversation with Elaine. I stood there in disbelief, the letter trembling in my hand, feeling invisible in my own home. I left for college at the earliest opportunity, partly to get away from the family dynamic that suffocated me. My father was practically silent during our parting handshake. My mother gave me a stiff hug, advising me not to let my grades slip. Elaine was the only one who acted halfway sentimental about my departure. She gave me a small wave and said, "I'll miss you," but even that felt hollow, like a rehearsed line in a school play. I found the distance liberating. Suddenly, I wasn't overshadowed by someone else's brilliance. I could focus on my studies, my track pursuits, and making new friends who had no idea of my past or my sister. It was both exhilarating and sad because I realized how starved I'd been for genuine attention. In college, I wasn't anyone's overshadowed sibling. I was just me. Every now and then, I'd come home for the holidays. Each time, I'd brace myself. My parents' house was a shrine to Elaine's achievements. Trophies, plaques, certificates, and framed photos lined the walls in the living room. My old pictures, once pinned to the refrigerator, had been replaced by more recent photos of Elaine in elaborate dance costumes or Elaine standing next to a winning science project. If I pointed out the disparity, my mother would say, "Oh, we just haven't updated the family photos in a while," or "There's only so much space on the refrigerator, dear." It was a losing battle every time. On top of that, Elaine herself seemed to have grown more confident, if not smug. She'd toss her hair and talk about her impending future at some prestigious university, how Marcus was probably going to propose after graduation, and how she had everything mapped out. Meanwhile, I'd stand there in the same living room, a visitor in my own home, nodding politely and counting the minutes until I could escape. Still, I kept a lid on the resentment. I told myself that success was good for her, that just because she was the golden child didn't mean my life had to be overshadowed forever. I tried to be civil for the sake of the family. I told myself I'd eventually carve out a space in the world where my accomplishments stood tall, but each visit felt like a dagger of envy stabbing me in the back. I'd watch her flit about the house, parents trailing after her with a camera or their phones, capturing every moment. Even a simple family dinner at a restaurant turned into an elaborate celebration of Elaine's existence. All of that changed the summer I turned 20. I was back in town, working as an intern at the local hospital while balancing some summer classes online. The internship wasn't glamorous. I mostly filed paperwork, ran errands, and occasionally helped with patient intake forms. One afternoon, Elaine dropped by the hospital unannounced, presumably because she needed help with something for her volunteer club. She brought along Marcus, who was sporting his usual smug grin. While I was grabbing lunch from the cafeteria, she sauntered in, scanned the crowd, and spotted me at a small table. She sashayed over, took one look at my budget-friendly meal, a simple salad and a cup of soup, and snorted, "Oh, you're eating here? That's sad. Marcus and I are going to that new bistro across town." I shrugged, forced a smile, and said I'd see them later. Inside, I felt a familiar twinge of hurt. Even my hospital lunch was fodder for her scorn. I watched as she looped her arm through Marcus's and waltzed out, their laughter echoing down the hallway. My appetite vanished. It was the beginning of a series of events that would make my frustration boil over. That same evening, our parents hosted a family dinner. I hadn't planned to go, but my mother guilted me into attending, saying Elaine was bringing Marcus and it would be such a nice way to catch up. When I arrived, I felt instantly out of place. My father shook Marcus's hand with pride as though they'd been longtime buddies, while ignoring my presence until I stepped right into his line of sight. Elaine was showing off a new bracelet, claiming it was a present from Marcus's mother, who simply adores me. She batted her eyelashes in my direction, and I knew it was just another way to subtly rub her charmed life in my face. Trying to keep the peace, I took a seat at the dinner table and tried to stay quiet. Midway through dinner, conversation rolled around to my internship. I tried to describe some of the tasks I'd been doing, the people I'd met, the lessons I'd learned. My father nodded absently, my mother stared at her phone, and Elaine cut me off mid-sentence, exclaiming how she planned on shadowing a prominent surgeon next summer at a prestigious hospital in another state. The table erupted in congratulations, overshadowing my modest achievements. I sighed and let them do their usual dance of adoration. When dinner ended, I went outside to get some air. I needed to step away from the stifling environment. My bike, which I'd ridden over, was parked on the side of the driveway, chained to a lamppost. I was certain I'd locked it. Yet, when I finished my short walk around the block, my bike was gone. Panicked, I looked all over, thinking maybe I'd forgotten where I put it. But the lock was clipped in half on the ground. A wave of cold anger washed over me. Who would steal a bike during a family dinner in a safe suburban neighborhood? As I searched, I heard snickers from across the street and turned to see Marcus and Elaine leaning against his shiny black car. Marcus was flipping something in his hand, a small bolt cutter maybe? Elaine's expression was that infuriating mixture of mischief and superiority. I demanded to know what they were laughing about, and she replied, "Oh, lighten up, it's just a bike. Maybe if you didn't insist on riding around town like a little kid, you'd have a real mode of transportation." My blood boiled. I asked if they knew anything about what happened to my bike. Marcus shrugged, looked away, and Elaine rolled her eyes as though the question itself was beneath her. I tried to hold on to my anger, tried to keep my composure, but I felt powerless. This was my property, stolen or vandalized, and they were mocking me for caring. I stomped back into the house, furious. No one inside paid much attention as I ranted that someone had taken my bike. My mother simply said, "Oh dear, that's unfortunate. We'll see if it turns up." My father asked if I locked it properly. Elaine and Marcus strolled in, feigning boredom. With a mocking grin, Elaine said, "Maybe you can buy a new one. After all that money you must be making at that fancy hospital cafeteria job of yours." She let out a high-pitched laugh. At that moment, I could barely contain the urge to scream. I realized that none of them would do anything to help me. The only person who seemed somewhat sympathetic was my grandmother, who gave me a meaningful look. But it wasn't enough. I left that night feeling the final fracture in my relationship with Elaine. She had crossed a line. I stewed over it for days, lodging a police report that I doubted would lead anywhere. My father told me I was overreacting. My mother insisted that I should just forget it. Elaine, of course, made no secret of how childish she found my fixation on a stolen bike. A few days later, I got a phone call from a guy who lived near a small pond at the edge of the neighborhood. He said he'd seen a bicycle that matched the description I'd posted on social media, a battered silver frame with a distinctive sticker, half submerged in the murky water. I rushed over, and sure enough, it was my bike, ruined beyond repair. The chain and gears were caked with mud and rust, and the seat was torn. My insides churned with outrage. I knew this wasn't random theft. This was someone's twisted game, and I had a strong hunch who was behind it. When I brought it up to my parents, they dismissed my concerns. My father even went so far as to say, "Elaine would never do such a thing. You know how paranoid you sound?" My mother agreed, cautioning me not to start any drama. That response hurt me more than the ruined bike itself. In their eyes, Elaine could do no wrong, even when confronted with glaring evidence. Their refusal to take my side triggered a new level of bitterness I'd never felt before. That night, I vowed I'd get revenge for everything she had put me through. The humiliations, the belittling remarks, the stolen bike, and especially her complete disregard for my feelings. This wasn't sibling rivalry, it was war. And I decided I'd fight back, but I'd do it strategically. I wasn't interested in a petty skirmish. I wanted to hit where it would really hurt, in a way that would make her realize I wasn't just a convenient doormat. I began by quietly collecting information. Over the years, Elaine had left a trail of stories, achievements, and sometimes half-truths about her success. She'd often boast about certain academic feats or extracurricular triumphs that seemed too good to be entirely accurate. I remembered an incident 2 years prior when she'd claimed to have single-handedly planned a charity fundraiser, only for me to discover through mutual acquaintances that she'd done little more than show up for the photo ops. There were rumors she'd fabricated part of a winning essay in a local scholarship contest. I had no proof at the time, but I'd heard whispers. Since Elaine loved posting everything on social media, I figured that was a good place to start digging. Over the course of a few weeks, I combed through her feeds, her old status updates, her photos with suspiciously grandiose captions. I took screenshots, compiled them, cross-referenced them with event timelines, and publicly available data on the school's website. I started to see patterns, dates that didn't match, achievements she couldn't possibly have done alone. It was a tapestry of deception, carefully woven to keep up the image of perfection. Simultaneously, I worked my internship at the hospital, maintaining an outward aura of normalcy. I didn't want her suspecting anything. If she thought I'd given up on the bike incident, so much the better. In truth, my rage had evolved into cold calculation. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction each time I uncovered a new piece of her facade. I'd think about how she had laughed at my cafeteria lunch, how she'd orchestrated my bike's destruction, and I'd press on, fueled by a thirst for justice that bordered on obsession. I kept my plans hidden even from my grandmother, who sometimes called to check in. She sensed something was off in my voice, but I offered only vague assurances that I was fine. This was a mission I had to complete alone. If I succeeded, I'd expose the real Elaine to the world, or at least to the people whose opinions mattered to her the most. And if I failed, I'd look like a bitter sibling trying to drag her down. The stakes were high, but I'd reached a point where the idea of letting her continue unscathed was intolerable. Over time, I assembled a detailed dossier of her exaggerations and lies. I discovered that she hadn't actually scored in the top 1 percentile on that national exam she boasted about. She was in the top 5 percentile, still good, but not the astounding achievement she'd told everyone. The chemistry project she claimed to have done solo was actually a group effort, and she'd overshadowed her teammates to claim the glory. The scholarship essay was riddled with plagiarism, lines lifted from obscure online sources. And there were at least 3 separate instances where she posted about volunteering for local charities on weekends when I'd seen her partying with Marcus at a lake house. The more I gathered, the more incredulous I became at how easily she had duped people. But then, I remembered how eager our parents were to believe in her perfection. They never questioned her. She was their golden child, and they wanted so badly for her to shine. It wasn't just about being right. It was about toppling the pedestal she'd been placed on, forcing her to confront the consequences of her behavior. A part of me balked at the idea of hurting her reputation. After all, was I really that vindictive? But then I'd recall her mocking laughter, the bolt cutters in Marcus's hand, and the way she'd destroyed my property without a shred of remorse. Forgiveness was not an option. I'd spent too many years being the lesser child. This was bigger than a stolen bike or an unkind comment. It was about reclaiming my self-respect. I decided to bide my time until the perfect moment. If I simply revealed her lies on social media, it might come across as petty. I needed a scenario where her illusions would collapse in front of our parents, her friends, and maybe even a few authority figures from school. Fortunately, an ideal opportunity was on the horizon: her big celebratory dinner for being accepted into that prestigious university's scholarship program. She was set to receive some local accolades, a few school officials would be attending, and our parents were planning a big to-do at a restaurant downtown. It was the perfect stage. In the lead-up to that event, I made sure to play the role of the disinterested older brother. I visited home a couple of times, feigning casual conversation about her scholarship. She teased me about my internship, flung a few offhand insults, and bragged that she might follow in my footsteps and do some real hospital work one day, just for fun. I bit my tongue and smiled, letting her believe I was too defeated to fight back. Meanwhile, my dossier of evidence grew more comprehensive. I had screenshots, email attachments from whistleblowers, who disliked her in silence, and even a couple of recorded statements from her own ex-friends. The night of the dinner arrived. Our parents, beaming with pride, rented a private room at a fancy restaurant. There were about 30 people in attendance: family, close friends, some teachers, and the local press reporter who occasionally covered exceptional youth stories. Elaine walked in like royalty, wearing a chic dress and radiating smugness. Marcus strolled by her side, playing the role of adoring boyfriend. I arrived, politely shook hands, and sat at a table near the back, quietly observing. The entire night was a self-congratulatory affair. The first few speeches were nauseating praises of Elaine's unwavering dedication and brilliance. Finally, Elaine stood to give her acceptance speech. She talked about how she'd overcome countless obstacles, how she balanced volunteering, extracurriculars, and academics to achieve this scholarship. She thanked her parents for their unwavering support, her teachers for nurturing her talents, and she even threw in a line or two about how I'd been her inspiration. I nearly choked on my drink when she said that, recalling how she'd relentlessly mocked me for years. But I kept my composure. I waited until the applause died down. Then, I rose from my seat, clapped slowly, and asked if I could say a few words. The tension in the room grew palpable. Elaine's smile wavered slightly as she saw me approach the podium with a folder in my hand. I thanked everyone for coming, congratulated Elaine on her achievements, and then said something along the lines of, "I just want to make sure we acknowledge the full scope of her accomplishments tonight." I opened the folder and began distributing printouts to the guests. On those sheets were examples of Elaine's plagiarized essay excerpts, complete with references to the original sources. Some pages showed timestamps of her supposed volunteer hours matched against photos of her drinking at a lake party. I read aloud a few lines from statements made by the group members she had overshadowed on the chemistry project, detailing how she'd taken credit for their work. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the rustling of paper as confused guests flipped through the damning evidence. Elaine's face turned from confident smirk to abject horror. My parents looked bewildered. The teachers in attendance glanced at each other, some red-faced. I locked eyes with my mother, who shook her head in dismay, but I didn't care. I pressed on, outlining each lie. I kept my tone measured, factual, and calm. This wasn't a rant, it was an execution. By the time I finished, Elaine was trembling. Marcus tried to rush to her defense, sputtering that this was all fabricated, but I'd done my homework. I had verifiable references, clear screenshots, even official timestamps. The local reporter scribbled furiously in a notepad, probably salivating over the scandalous angle. I'd left nothing to chance. The aftermath was immediate and intense. Some guests stood up and left, murmuring their disbelief. The teachers conferred among themselves, outraged that they'd been hoodwinked. My father stumbled to his feet, barking at me, "What the hell is this?" My mother looked like she might faint. Elaine burst into tears, sobbing that I'd ruined her entire future. I answered calmly, "I didn't ruin anything. You did. This is who you really are." Then I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. The rush of adrenaline in my veins felt like fire, and for the first time, I experienced a sense of liberation. After years of living in her shadow, I'd finally broken free, even if it meant burning bridges behind me. In the days that followed, chaos engulfed my parents' household. Elaine lost her scholarship after the university got wind of the plagiarism allegations. The local press ran a short piece on exaggerated achievements by a scholarship recipient, though they kept her name anonymous. Still, everyone in our town knew who it was. My parents tried to do damage control, meeting with school officials and calling in favors to salvage Elaine's reputation, but the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. Her golden child aura was tarnished beyond repair. She tried to contact me, leaving tearful voicemails about how I had betrayed family, how she hadn't really meant to do all those things, how I'd taken it too far. I deleted them all without responding. I'd spent years swallowing my pride, watching her manipulate everyone, endure no consequences, and mock me whenever she could. There was no going back from this. I felt no sympathy, only the satisfying weight of well-deserved retribution. My father, who rarely showed emotion, cornered me one evening when I stopped by to pick up some old boxes from their garage. He demanded to know if I enjoyed destroying my sister's future. I told him calmly that I didn't enjoy it, but I didn't regret it either. She had it coming, and if they'd bothered to notice how toxic she'd been all these years, maybe it wouldn't have escalated to this point. My mother tried to soften things, tearfully asking if I could find it in my heart to forgive and move on. Her words made me feel strangely numb. If they had shown me a fraction of this concern before, maybe I'd care, but they'd made it clear who their priority was, time and again. So I told her the truth. There was nothing to forgive because Elaine's actions were unforgivable. And if they couldn't accept that, well, it was their loss. With that, I walked out of my parents' house for what might be the last time. I heard Elaine crying in the next room, but I felt no pity. The sweet taste of revenge had finally washed away the bitterness I'd carried for so long. From that day on, I refused to be defined by her or by the skewed family dynamic that made my life hell. I had set the record straight, reclaimed my sense of self-worth, and left them all to deal with the consequences. And for once, I slept soundly, free of the weight of her shadow.